forced me in the position of poaching a trout. Now, actually, the trout that I have in the creel here isn't poached, but it's going to be in just a few minutes. Now, a favorite way of preparing trout, of course, is sautéing them in butter. And when you're at a Northwoods cabin sometime, you might want to try something a little special, you know, a recipe that has a gourmet touch. And for this recipe, what we'll need is a green pepper, an onion, some cheddar cheese soup for a topping, a few peppercorns, some thyme, a medium-sized carrot, along with a bottle of white wine. Probably need the whole bottle. Might as well check the label and buy Michigan wine as long as you're cooking a Michigan trout. And you'll also need some wine vinegar. And that's about it, except for the trout, of course. Now, in this case, we're going to cook one trout, and this recipe is for poached trout. Now, poaching is a method of cooking where it's sort of boiling the meat, or boiling the fish in this case, on the stove. And the first step is to put the trout in a shallow frying pan and cover it halfway with water. Now, the reason that we're just covering this halfway is that we're just actually measuring out the liquid at this time. We want equal parts of water to wine, so now we're going to add enough wine to cover the trout, so that'll give us a 1-to-1 ratio. Now, obviously, it's best to use the smallest fry pan that you can fit the trout into, otherwise you'll end up using an awful lot of water and wine. An omelet pan really seems to work out pretty well. It has sloping sides. Now, I know this seems strange, but we did take the trout out of the pan, set it aside for a while. The only reason we put it in there originally, as I said, was to measure out the liquid. And then what we do is we chop an onion, about a half of an onion, and put this into the liquid along with half of a chopped green pepper. Next step is to chop the carrot and add this to the soup, followed by 5 peppercorns. And we add a pinch of thyme, followed by 1 tablespoon of wine vinegar, more or less. Of course, part of the charm of gourmet cooking is playing like you know how much of each ingredient you're putting in. When you're just cooking one trout for yourself, you can take a few liberties. Of course, most people would take liberties with the wine maybe than the vinegar, but it was a rough day. Anyhow, we set this nutritious liquid on the burner and simmer it for about 20 minutes. Now, the vegetables will cook down into really sort of a luscious-smelling soup. And after about 20 minutes, when this is on the stove, you add the trout. Now, the sauce we're going to pour over the trout is made by whipping some hot cheddar cheese soup. And we do this without diluting the soup from the can, and in order to heat it without burning the pan, it's a good idea to use a double boiler, or at least put one pan inside of another pan of boiling water. This will prevent it from burning and sticking. You could heat it in a saucepan, if you want to, but be very careful with the heat. And without an automatic dishwasher in the cabin, really, you don't want to burn any pans. Now, you do dilute the soup with, if you're going to follow this recipe exactly, you dilute 4 tablespoons of the poaching liquid with 1/4 of a can of the cheddar cheese soup. In this case, I just dumped it all in together, just sort of improvised. I couldn't figure out what I was going to do with 3/4 of a can of cheddar cheese soup, so I just made a big batch of the topping. Now, I whipped it there with a fork, which is all we had at the cabin. A wire whisk or a beater might be better for this, but again, they're sort of murder to wash in a Northwoods cabin. Now, this is a pretty fancy meal. I thought I might as well dress for it. And since this was poached trout, I wanted to look good for the occasion. The trout and I were both garnished in green, and we sat down to enjoy this meal together. Now, this really is how you can poach a trout and not have to worry about the conservation officers.